Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this webcast hosted by the American College Cary M. Maguire Center for Ethics and Financial Services. I'm Domarina Oshana, the Center's Director of Research and Operations, and I thank you for joining us. We called our panel today Insights from Behavioral Science to Promote Ethical Decision-Making because it's consistent with the Center's mission of offering research and programs to help individuals and companies think more critically about solutions for the benefit of society. Our panel's focus is on how ethics and compliance practitioners can use behavioral science to understand and influence organizational culture. Our panelists will share insights at the intersection of behavioral science and ethics, including research on motivating ethical behavior and how ethics and compliance practitioners can guide their financial firms toward ethical excellence. I am very happy to introduce our panelists and tell you a bit about their professional backgrounds. Azish Filabi is the Managing Director of the American College Cary M. Maguire Center for Ethics and Financial Services. She is also the Charles Lamont Post Chair of Business Ethics and an Associate Professor at the American College of Financial Services. At the college, Azish leads the strategy and research programs of the Center for Ethics, including its annual Forum on Ethical Leadership. She also co-teaches the Advanced Strategies for Building Trust Certificate program, which is a bespoke workshop for leaders in business. Additionally, Azish teaches and designs courses in the college's master's programs. Katie Lawler is Executive Vice President and Global Chief Ethics Officer at U.S. Bank. In her role, Katie reinforces the bank's commitment to operating with ethics and integrity. Notably, Katie established a strategy around a new and innovative approach for financial services, creating psychological safety in her workplace. This allows employees to use their voices to report on ethical conduct and share ideas for improvement and growth. And we will talk about that more during this webcast. We'll learn more about it as a discovery in behavioral science. Todd Haugh is an Associate Professor of Business Law and Ethics, Director of the Institute for Corporate Governance and Ethics, and a board member and Jesse Fine Fellow of the Poynter Center for the Study of Ethics in American Institutions at Indiana University. Todd's scholarship focuses on white-collar and corporate crime, business and behavioral ethics, and federal sentencing policy, exploring the decision-making processes of the players most central to the commission and adjudication of economic crime and unethical business conduct. We were fortunate to have Todd participate in our 2023 Forum on Ethical Leadership, and Todd currently serves as a member of the Ethics Center's Advisory Council. And we also have Wieke Scholten. Wieke Scholten is an organizational and social psychologist with a PhD in social sciences. She is the author of the book Banking on Team Ethics, a team climate perspective on root causes of misconduct in financial services. Wieke owns a behavioral risk management practice, BR Insights, working globally in financial services from out of the Netherlands, and she was the former head of a behavioral risk team in the internal audit function at NatWest in London. Previously, she has been at the Dutch Central Bank as a supervisor of behavior and culture in the banking industry. So we definitely have this all-star panel for you, and we'll get started with our topics for the discussion today. I'd like to start with the broad topic of behavioral science discoveries. I've read about concepts such as ethical nudges and psychological safety, and more recently, I heard of corrupted barrels, a distinction from corrupted apples. I'd love to unpack these for our audience and understand why this topic is important right now, especially from the lens of moving from theory to practice. What's exciting about these discoveries and why should our audience care is my key question for our all-star panel. As you each weigh in, panelists with your unique perspective, please consider sharing anecdotes or concrete examples demonstrating the application of these concepts so that our audience can walk away with substantial value and the ability to apply the information. So welcome panel. Azish, I'd love to start with you and your thoughts on this topic.
Well, thank you so much, Domi, for the kind introductions and for kicking off the panel. I'm going to start big picture and address the why is this topic important aspect of your question. And I have three concepts that I want to be able to share with you all. One is that, unfortunately, corporate ethics failures continue to happen and affect us as both investors in business, but also stakeholders in society at large. Whenever I talk about this topic, I like to emphasize that the majority of businesses are managing good, ethical companies. It's by no means the norm in business, but almost every week there's a major business ethics issue that you'll see as a headline in the papers. You know, I looked this morning before, as we were prepping for this panel, the E. coli outbreak at McDonald's, which is a company that's also been struggling with lower sales post-pandemic, points to a challenging food safety ethical issue within an organization. TD Bank last week has pled guilty to about $3 billion in penalties for facilitating money laundering. Boeing Corporation continues to manage the fallout from its failures from back in 2018 and 2019 through the airline crashes. So I think this matters because it feeds into the cynicism and distrust that many people say they continue to have in our institutions. Seeing these types of headlines persist, I think, is a challenge that we all need to be focused on. The second is that when there is a failure, there's a tendency to point to the bad apple within an organization. That's to say that management might isolate just a team or a person that had been at fault within that specific scandal or failure. But the research, as you'll see presented by our panelists today, they'll be talking about patterns that show that there are certain behavioral and cultural dynamics that are persistent across these failures, and they create environments where ethics failures are more likely to happen. So I think the behavioral science is important because that human behavioral element is really the crux of why we continue to see ethical failures within organizations. And then the last thing I'll say in terms of the big picture and why this is important is that the regulators are also considering how culture is part of their enforcement processes, and they're asking companies to emphasize it as part of their compliance programs, which as many people know, the US federal sentencing guidelines have had it in their guidelines since the 90s, but we're also seeing other regulators, such as the New York Fed through their culture and governance education programs, or even the SEC. I've seen in some of their recent enforcement actions, particularly the one from last year where there was an enforcement action against EY with respect to cheating on CPA exams. They, as part of their remediation, explicitly asked the firm to review and evaluate whether their culture is supportive of ethical and compliant conduct. So it really gets down to the behavioral science of ethics, and I'm excited to hear from the other panelists in terms of the trends that they're seeing.
Thank you, Azish. That really is very helpful background. And I have another question that I'm saving for later about ethics education, where I read about TD Bank, and we'll get to it. So more to come there. Wieke, I'd love for you to weigh in and build on Azish's thoughts, especially with the behavioral science discoveries.
Thank you so much. And yeah, maybe to start also with a little bit of good news when after Azish, I think, very valid points that this keeps being a point of attention, the way organizations and the way we look at ethical behavior, because incidents keep happening. And I think that in itself is something that we also need to embrace. So let me talk about that in a moment. So first of all, the good news, I think most of us want to do the right thing. And that's not just what I think, that's also what indeed behavioral science and experimental research shows us. Let's say 95% of us want to do a good job want to do what is expected of us in our organizations, and do not have an intention to harm others in any way, whether we talk about our organization, our colleagues, our customers, clients, society. People want to do the right thing. However, what we understand from behavioral science is that in our daily work context, there are aspects in that context that may encourage or invite unethical behavior. And I think what is crucial in that is a behavioral science insight that has been around for a while, but it's interesting to see in financial services that it takes us a while to really embrace that. So in my practice, I still see indeed bad apple responses. And that's also what we tend to do, because if we see something go wrong, it feels better to say, yeah, but that was him or her and not us. But there, I think, without excusing, if there's unethical acts, there's often also a form of consequence or disciplinary measures. But I feel that next to that, if we want to better prevent future issues, we need to look at what was really causing that. And that sits in that daily work context. Maybe last point to note, what I find in this work interesting as well to think about is this is often not about intentions, as I say, but is that also a reason why it makes it difficult to explore unethical acts? Because we want to believe that we will not act unethically, whilst everybody here on this panel is able to act unethically. That has moral intentions, unfortunately, do not predict moral behavior. So that is intention has nothing to do with it. So I would encourage every financial institution to be curious about what in people's daily working life at that shop floor may invite unethical acts, whilst nobody wants that.
I love that. Thank you, Wieke. I want to come back to that if we have time to dig a little deeper. Right now, I want to turn to Katie, because I know, Katie, at US Bank, you have some experience with creating that environment, right? Love for you to weigh in with your perspective.
Thanks, Dami. You know, I think it starts for me is if you look, as you've already heard from Wieke and Azish, if you look at just about any corporate scandal in recent memory, what you're going to find is it wasn't a failure to have the right policy or the right rules. It was or some rogue employee. It's almost always starts with that unhealthy corporate culture, and that's the rotten barrel or the bad barrel, the corrupt barrel. It's the barrel is your culture. And so I think especially for leaders, that temptation, as Vika said, to say, oh, it's just some bad actors, I think we really have to resist that urge to blame rogue employees, the bad apple, and confront the fact that the environment that we're in and the environment that we create and the environment that we tolerate has such a strong influence on how people actually behave. The decisions that they make in the moment when they're facing a challenge or pressure or a deadline or a need to get something done. So as we've built and matured our program, we really realize that we have to be responsive to the moment. We have to understand the world our employees are operating in to really understand how to support them. And I think what I appreciate about behavioral science, and I am not trained in this area, I'm a recovering lawyer. It really does help us understand how that environment impacts the decision making, how the environment, whether for good or bad, impacts the choice that an individual is making right now somewhere in my organization. And so we did start with this focus on psychological safety because I think that is your foundation. Because without psychological safety, you're almost guaranteed to have a rotten barrel, and really worse yet, you probably won't even know it without psychological safety until something goes wrong. And so I believe strongly that we need to create environments where people can contribute their ideas, share their mistakes, help us identify our missteps, because we're going to make them. Companies only act through humans, and humans make mistakes, have bad days, exercise bad judgment. We have cognitive biases that get in the way. And so without psychological safety, or with psychological safety, hopefully we can get ahead of that before there's a really big outcome, a really negative outcome. So for us, that's some of how we are thinking about it, and why it's important to us to understand sort of the behavioral science behind decision making.
Thanks, Katie. I would just have one quick question before I turn to Todd, because I know he has extensive research on this topic. At US Bank, what would you say are the specific behaviors you've seen at play that are necessary to creating psychological safety?
It's a great question. We started out, and when I was asked to create the Global Ethics Office in 2017, when you go out and you talk to others in the field, everybody was telling me you've got to focus on building a speak up culture. And maybe I'm a contrarian, but I think putting speak up first gets it backwards. And so we really thought, like, what are the barriers to someone speaking up? And it's that they don't think anyone's going to listen. They're afraid of retaliation. They don't think anything will happen. So realizing that you've got to have a listen up culture first and a follow up culture. And so we actually adopted a little mantra in my team: speak up, listen up, follow up. And because when you start with speak up as the message, you're putting the burden on the employee, the person with the least power in the dynamic. Typically, you're asking the lowest power person to have courage. And I think the onus should be on leaders first to create an environment of listening and action. So really leaning in on the role of the leader, and then thinking about team dynamics and how they shape the environment, so that someone isn't spending 3 days debating how to say something, whether to say something, is it worth it? What's the blowback going to be? Am I committing career suicide? Are people going to think I'm just negative, not a team player, difficult? So what we've done is we've really gotten granular with specific tactics that people and teams can adopt to help break down some of those barriers, thinking through kind of, we worked with our behavioral science team last year to behavior map what does it take for someone to speak up, and what are the barriers that they may confront, and starting to think about how do you address some of those barriers. I mean, I did a talk with a group yesterday, and to me it starts with, if someone comes to you, no matter how big a problem or small a problem, the first words anyone should say is thank you, and the second word should be tell me more. It's that simple. But then also, we've talked about what it isn't, what psychological safety isn't, and I think we're going to talk about that later, because there are a lot of myths. And I think one of them is, people think it's somebody else's job to make them feel safe. And I really believe it is a team sport. It's not permission to say anything, to be abrasive or difficult or rude or disrespectful. So we spend a fair amount of time too talking about what it isn't, but we've talked about how can you help bring in and empower other voices. So what's a tactic you can add to a team meeting or a one-on-one that you can help to engage people and say, like, make it clear, I really want to hear these other perspectives. I want to know. So people start role modeling that, and then recognizing and rewarding the behavior, because, worst thing that happens, employee comes to you, they think you did nothing, or they think you were punitive. Not only are they never going to come back to you, they're going to tell their coworkers, don't bother, it's not safe. So really helping leaders know how to respond productively has been a big focus for us.
I love that. Thank you, Katie. The thank you and the tell me more are really practical. Todd, I want you to weigh in on this because I know you have done extensive research, so I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, first of all, thanks everyone for having me. Happy to be here. Particularly happy to hear comments like Katie just gave, right? So I think if more E&C leaders had this kind of what I would just call like a behavioral mindset when they look at the either challenges in the organization or how they want to structure a program or what have you, I think we'd all be in a lot better place. Also happy to hear that there's some behavioral scientists kind of on the payroll there that you're drawing from that expertise. I think the threads that I'm hearing through the comments is basically this understanding that it is not just an individual problem, it's not a bad apple problem, and it's not just a barrels or organizational problem, right? There's always this interplay between the two, and that really is how we have to think of how do we affect conduct and behavior of real human beings, right? Not what some economic model might suggest how people will react, how an incentive program or something, just because it's been done that way in the past, how that is going to work. We really have to do the work in order to figure out what is that behavioral chain that's going to lead either to the behavior that we don't want or the behavior that we do want? And how do we figure out, can we intervene in that chain in a way that's going to help people be more ethical? Because I think Wieke's point is exactly right? All the research essentially says, most people don't set out in their day-to-day to commit a crime, but we also overestimate our own ethicality. We tend to think, we're more ethical than we are, and we very much don't understand the oftentimes hidden influences to our own behavior. And so if you really, really want to change ethical behavior and conduct in your organizations, you sort of have to be kind of like a type of behavioral scientist. And that just really means having a behavioral mindset and having kind of a scientific mindset, which means you're really willing to dig in and figure out like what are the steps in that process to get to the behavior that you want. And then also I'll mention, you really have to be thinking about how we're going to measure the benefits or the changes that are going to happen, because otherwise we're just kind of doing like behavioral intuition as opposed to behavioral science. And so we got to be really careful with that. The avenue that I have taken in my research is to try to think about, how do we create an environment? And if you want to use behavioral science terms, you could sort of think about how do we create a choice environment under which we can intervene. So we're trying, yes, to nudge employees or just make it easier for them to essentially do the things that they generally want to do, which is, do the right thing, go through work in an ethical manner, get a paycheck, get some enjoyment out of their work, provide for their families and things like that. And so in lots of the stuff that I've done, I'm just trying to think about, how do we use behavioral sciences, how the drivers of that, of behavior, in order to help people become more ethical. So I'll just give you one very simple example, something that any, ethics and compliance group can think about. I worked with a company where they were trying to increase non-anonymous reports to their helpline, because, as you know, anonymous reports are a lot harder to deal with, and it gets to that point that Katie's bringing up, right? It's hard to follow up if you don't exactly know, who to talk to and what happened. And so we were able to, through kind of a workshop framework, the team sort of mapped out all the different behaviors that would lead to the point in which someone would select being anonymous or non-anonymous. And so that has lots of organizational components, but it also has some just real simple individual ones, and a couple little tweaks to messaging around the software where people sort of, report wrongdoing, and also even just switching a default from anonymous to non-anonymous. That drove up non-anonymous reporting by a pretty significant percentage, and it's a measurable change. So, that's a very small example, what I would call kind of like a, behavioral ethics nudge there, that actually really impacts the company, because a lot of these behavioral interventions work through scale, right? Sometimes they're very small, but if you think about aggregating them over the entire company or your workforce, they can have real impacts on things like positive culture.
That's very helpful insight. So I want to continue that thread around affecting change and cultivating a behavioral mindset. To me, it's a great segue to talk about ethics education. I wanted to share with you and get your perspective on this, the whole panel, but I want to start with you, Todd. I read with great interest an article this past spring, and it was from a Fordham law professor, Joseph Burke, published the article, was in Corporate Compliance Insights. It raised the question of why compliance education is not keeping up with the growing demand for CCOs, Chief Compliance Officers. Drawing from the U.S. Census Bureau of Labor Statistics, Burke noted that in 2022, there were 359,640 compliance officers employed in the U.S. He underscores that this number has increased steadily over the past decade, rising from 236,000 about 90 in 2013, and that's an increase of more than 50%, while all occupations across the economy grew only 11% in that time. And Burke sets that startling trend against the backdrop of seemingly unabated corporate scandals, which Azish noted earlier, such as those that made headlines by Bank of America, Wells Fargo, as well as federal authorities call for a strong compliance function as a difference maker in their investigations. So in this context, Burke makes a compelling argument that law and compliance are not the same. He pointing to the failure of education for future compliance practitioners. He shines a light on the biggest disconnect in education, that neither business schools nor law schools are effectively teaching ethics and how to incorporate ethical decision-making into daily compliance practices. Promoting the difference between ethics and compliance is also one of the initiatives at our Center for Ethics. So this was an article I read with a lot of interest, and I think it's especially relevant given the most recent banking scandal involving TD Bank. So I'm curious to hear each panelist's perspectives, and for the professors like you, Todd, I'm wondering, how are you teaching students the principles of compliance and ethics that will serve them throughout their careers? Is there an ethical decision-making framework that you recommend or educational guidance that you incorporate in your classroom to prepare students to apply an ethical mindset in their workplace?
Yeah, so I'll speak, from my experience at the Kelley School. Although, I think I maybe have a comment or two on kind of larger trends in academia related to business ethics. But at Kelley, we have a very unique situation. We're one of the largest business law and ethics departments in the country. We teach, 8,000, almost 10,000 now undergrads and MBA students. I teach 3 primary classes: traditional business ethics class. I teach a white-collar crime class, and I teach a class in the MBA program called Critical Thinking, which is sort of an antiquated title because I basically teach it now as sort of judgment and decision science for managers is how I characterize it. I think so I guess to answer the question, yes, there are lots of ethical frameworks out there. I use one called the principles approach or the Georgetown approach that tries to actually get at principles that govern behavior as opposed to just presenting ethical dilemmas and then sort of saying, well, there's a bunch of frameworks that you could use and we're not quite sure, how we're going to end up. Everyone's going to differ. I don't like that type of thing because I think it invites a lot of kind of moral relativism that I think is potentially problematic. So I use a particular one, but either way, I think the approach that I have taken to try to get to this problem is I really try to think about the ethical decision-making process. I'm trying to help students uncover and understand how they make ethical decisions and then use that as a way to understand the ethical decisions of those around them, right? And with the idea that when they become managers, which many of them either are really on pace to being, or just by virtue of being at the Kelley School, they're likely to be a manager in their future. They're thinking about what are the ways that I can affect behavior and how can I understand the decision-making of others. So, I don't know that is, I wouldn't say that approach is totally unique, but I don't think that that's necessarily the way that ethics education has been looked at, historically. And certainly it's not the way how we tend to think about kind of law and compliance and ethics. I tend to start with the decision-making process and then build out. And I think maybe most of it so far, particularly in compliance, has kind of been more from this legal framework.
Thank you, Todd. I'm curious, Wieke, what are your thoughts on that disconnect and frameworks for ethical decision-making?
Well, and thank you, Todd. That was very interesting. I learned a lot. I think what we see or what I've seen, for example, when I was working at the regulator, we conducted these board effectiveness reviews where we went into senior leadership teams and looked at the way decisions were taking shape. I think processes, procedures, like Katie rightfully alluded to, have an impact, but is often not enough, right? So to work with these type of frameworks or this head that Todd was just referring to, I think helps senior leadership teams or teams to make more ethical decisions. What I would add to that is to then also always look back on where you were not really being successful in that. So again, from the intent to normalize that even though we want to take ethical decisions, there will be instances in a year where we don't. So can we then at the end, like a standard practice, look back on when was the last time I did something that was unethical? When was the last time as a senior leadership team we were actually struggling with this? You know, we want to do this, but we actually did a little bit of that. And what was causing that? Because if you understand what drivers are specific to your organization in these type of situations, you can address them to even more encourage yourself to improve. I think that is my point. It's a continuous identification, assessment, and mitigation of the, let's say, risk of making unethical decisions. But that can only happen if we accept that we all make unethical decisions, no matter how well we organize that formal environment, for example. Yeah.
That's very helpful. Could I just ask a follow-up? And I know Katie talked about this earlier, and we'll get into it when I turn to Katie next. But I'm just curious to know, is there a downside to psychological safety and the culture behind ethical decision making?
One of the things actually that we look at a lot is how do you respond to mistakes? Yeah? So Katie already referred to that as well. How do you respond to things that go wrong? It's so important if you want to build psychological safety. But to your question, what is the downside? What I do see in financial services or financial institutions is that, first of all, there's so much research showing psychological safety is very important to speak out. Yep. What the downside is that I see speaks to a point that I think also Katie mentioned earlier, that if people feel that some people in a team, for example, when I look at team climates and there's a high psychological safety, and some people make, let's say, also use of that by being very vocal about their stance points. And sometimes also in this, maybe that's also in a political environment, when I look at Europe, you could bring in also lots of personal convictions and opinions and being very vocal about that can unintentionally crowd out some of the speak up of others. So I think, again, with psychological safety, it's not something you fix. What I think in our industry is so important that when we still talk about culture as something you need to fix, like measure with a survey, for example, with how does psychological safety has spread across our group? Oh, there's this business area over here, and there are some teams over there that score a bit lower on psychological safety. Let's do some interventions to fix that, and then it will be fine. Whilst what I try to talk about, I think every day in my work, is this is something you do continuously. Like, what if I have in my team great psychological safety, but then next year I don't? So it's, and also with high psychological safety, you still have to always be identifying what is it in how we do things here, what aspects of how we do things here may unintentionally drive a risk, such as the risk of unethical.
Can I add to that?
Yeah,
Because I could not agree more with Wieke. I talk about psychological safety when I'm doing workshops and out in front of groups. Is it's not static. It's constantly changing. And in fact, I always use this example. Like I have a great relationship with the person I report to. I have a great relationship with him. I trust him. But there are some times where even with that, depending on the topic, depending on what I know his concern is going to be, or he's going to be concerned about someone else's reaction, it may be harder to speak up. It's not just one and done, and it's not like every moment of every day you feel psychologically safe in this interaction. It can vary depending on so many other dynamics. It is a constant work. It's never going to be done. And And from one day to the next, one topic to the next, I might feel more safe talking to this person about this topic and less safe on another topic with the same person because the dynamics are different or the other people impacted or what he's going to have to do about it and what his concerns are going to be. So it's one of the things I talk about a lot is like really try to understand, because we're also trying to teach people how to do this effectively. Like when you're going to speak up, you got to, there's ways to do it and be more effective. And so that's one of the things. Consider your audience, consider what their needs are, what their concerns going to be. So I couldn't agree more with what Wieke said. It is not one and done.
Katie, I want to underscore a word you said, which was trust. And I know Azish has led a lot of research in this area, so I want to get Azish's thoughts on this question of ethics, education, and compliance.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I feel like there's so much commonality as I listen to my co-panelists discuss this challenge. And part of why it comes up for us at the Center for Ethics is that in financial services, we're in an industry that is pretty regulated. And there is this kind of tendency to believe that because of the regulation, the ethics issues have been addressed. And I think, Domi, as I reflect on your question of this tension between ethics and compliance, I do see there's this tendency to focus on law. And as a former lawyer myself, I can understand it's tangible. There's potential consequence and penalties if you get it wrong. But from an education perspective, I think the law is helpful for people to understand what to do. So you have a fiduciary duty of loyalty and care, for example, but you have to look to ethics to understand how to do your job to fulfill those duties. And that gets to the behavioral. So I have become a perennial student of behavioral science because of that gap between your day-to-day choices that you make in an organization and what the law is setting for you as a minimum standard. The tendency to have a bias towards action in business is something we all live with every day. We are in organizations that are goal-oriented, they're driven towards success, and we would like for them to be that way. But on the same token, what I'm hearing from the co-panelists is that ethics requires self-reflection, it requires critical thinking, it requires creating psychological space to reflect on your own mistakes of others in the team, and to talk about that. And a lot of that requires deliberate effort. So when it comes to thinking about ethics education, I do like to take a systems approach to that. So that includes law as a system. As I think about some of the work that we've done at the center on the financial space, thinking about financial advisory services and businesses in particular, the role of incentives is really important, right? How people are paid and what types of behaviors one should be aware of when it comes to ethics is a system that we should start with in terms of the conversation. But then I also think extending it to focusing on ethical awareness. And the cornerstone of ethical behavior is being aware that you are in an ethical judgment moment, and to be able to catch yourself to pause and make the right decisions and ask the right questions and seek the right support. A lot of that is easier said than done, but I think focusing on the behavioral science in education is important for those reasons.
Thank you, Azish. On that note, I did want to follow up with Katie with regard to creating ethics and compliance programs. Katie, I know you know something about building a great ethics and compliance program. In 2023, you were recognized as an innovative leader in the ethics and compliance industry and presented with an award by the Ethics and Compliance Initiative at their annual Global Ethics Conference. So I'm curious, how have you innovated in establishing an ethical foundation at US Bank that fosters this culture that we've been talking about of ethical decision-making, of critical thinking, of self-reflection from an in-house leadership position? We'd love to hear any stories you can share or concrete examples.
Sure. I've been very fortunate in this position at US Bank to have a lot of support from leadership, my leader in particular, who from the day we decided to create a standalone global ethics office was you got to really dig in onto behavioral science. We should be thinking about this. This is where it's going. And he's just been so supportive of that, and in giving us a lot of latitude to try different things. And we have the luxury of sitting separate from our compliance. So we have a huge regulatory compliance function, and I'm separate from that. And so I like to think about what my team does as sort of bridging culture and compliance. But we've had a lot of latitude, and I think it started as like, we've got the traditional elements of your program. You've got your code, you've got your hotline, you've got your basic annual training that everybody takes online and certifies. But what else is there? What does ethics really mean to us? And we landed on it. It really is about building trust, and an environment where every employee can come to work, make good decisions, feel supported, and really live out the bank's core values. And so understanding what motivates them, what they're concerned about, what they need, what may be the barriers, thinking about the environment that they're in, um, you know, and how we could then integrate and embed a focus on ethics into kind of the everyday, because I think Azish said it, it's how. It's not necessarily what we do, it really forms that foundation for how we do what we do, and how we decide what we should do versus what we can do. And so really embedding with HR, starting with, working with our recruiting team to embed into our interview guides questions to help them, the recruiters, assess people's, you know, sort of how they view ethics, how they align to our core values. We've worked with embedding ethics into one of the core behaviors that we are all held to in the organization. So really making sure ethics is woven into the fabric of the organization. But then we got to be creative, and this is probably the best part of my job is we really had to think about. We live in an era of information overload, right? I think I've taken 36 required training courses this year. And there's so much training, there's so much communication, there's so many communication vehicles. So how could we in the ethics office grab people's attention and start getting them thinking about ethics in a new way, thinking about what it means, knowing where to go? I was really reluctant at first. My team was like sort of trying to make me the face of ethics at US Bank, and it felt really weird. But I will say, I think there's been some benefit, um, because what we've done is elevate the team in a way that people know we're a group of human beings. We're not ethics. We're a group of people who care about the company and the employees and are here to be supportive. So I think one of the things we've really worked hard at is being visible, relatable, um, and accessible to employees. So I'll just give you a couple of examples of some of the things that we've done. First off is we always try to make our annual training course stand out. We've just like, I don't want it to just be a click through. So we've tried things like we did one year it was almost a podcast. It was an oral course. You had to listen, and it was a story of, we called it Tyler's Bad Day. Tyler was closing a loan for a customer. Customer missed a signature line, and was inaccessible, and that loan needed to close, and poor Tyler was getting beaten on by everybody in the company, was pressuring him to get this loan closed. So he forged the customer signature. He did the wrong thing for the right reason. But what we really illustrated with this was how many other people contributed to Tyler making that decision. That it wasn't just Tyler acting in a vacuum. And it was a really different way to approach and help people think about it. We did a video series. We haven't done it since the pandemic because for what, we couldn't be in cars together for a while, but it was like carpool karaoke except without singing. We called it the ethics rideshare, and it was me, one of our executives, and 2 GoPro cameras driving around in my car having a conversation. And they were really popular. People still come up to me and say, "When are you going to drive again?" But what we used it to do was to show how it was really me asking them questions and having a conversation about different corporate initiatives or their business or some topic, and how it connects to ethics and our core values of doing the right thing and putting people first. So finding ways to bring that visibility, those were really popular. We do a daily blog in our Microsoft Viva Engage community. It started out on a whim on day one of the pandemic when I was sitting at home in my bedroom with a third grader and a fifth grader doing homeschool right outside my door. And I had a folding card table and a dining room chair, and I had a monitor sitting on some books and some terrible ergonomics. And I was like, wow, this is really weird. And I went into our community, which had like 50 people in it, and said, Captain's log, quarantine, day one. And I wrote a little note about how it's really tough. We're going to get through it. We've got to support each other and take care of ourselves. And then some people read it, and so I went back and wrote more. And every day we try to write something. And for about 3.5, 4 years, it was all me. And sharing articles on leadership and ethics and self-care, and talking about how, all of these things come together. And then other groups come to us and ask me to highlight their initiatives. But it's been it's very informal. I was telling folks before this started, I am the oversharer in chief. But it's very deliberate, because what I want to do is really show partially it's just my personality, but personally, I really want people to know that Katie's a real person and cares about you, and you can pick up the phone and call her, and people do. Now we have somebody else on my team who writes two days a week, and I write 3, and we're on day 1,672 today. We did an Ask Me Anything yesterday, where we opened up and people submitted questions and I had to answer them. We call it our, my poster behind me, our tagline for our code is ethics inspired. We have an ethics inspired reading group. I have the people who comment and connect through the Viva Engage community. 2 people a month, I do a coffee with Katie, and they get 30 minutes with me. And then we've tried gamification and storytelling and just all of these different ways to help connect with employees and help them see the ethics in sort of the everyday. Whether it's examples from in the company, examples from outside the company. I just wrote a blog about the WNBA final game 5. As I said, Minnesota was robbed, but I digress. But about teamwork and what it takes to have a great team, and what makes a team special. So just any topic. So those are some of the things that we've tried to do, but always kind of keeping that focus on what do our employees need from us so that they can be their best self at work.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. That's very impressive. A lot of creativity there, and really appreciate those insights. I do want to just call on Azish, and I'm mindful of our time, but Azish, I'd love to kind of get your thoughts to wrap up this conversation around strategy on ethics education. I know you spent a lot of time leading in this area, so want to get your thoughts on how the Ethics Center is doing this work. Some of the key initiatives you've been leading are AI ethics and promoting trust in the financial industry. Can you help connect the dots panel's discussion to the Center for Ethics Strategy to meet the educational needs of the industry when it comes to ethics education?
Yes, absolutely. And I'll be brief, and I'll focus on our work around trust primarily, because I know we want to get to Q&A, and we want to encourage the audience to ask questions through the Q&A feature on the Zoom as well. So I love that Katie and US Bank, you're focusing on trust. We think it's such an important aspect of the two-way street that exists between financial institutions and stakeholders within the industry. And trust, I think, is a great construct, because ethics can be somewhat more nebulous for individuals, but trust, I think everyone has gut reaction and experience with it personally. So to be able to integrate that as part of an ethics education program, I think has been a feature of how we're doing it, because of the underlying importance to the success of the industry to be trusted. Domi, when you joined the center in 2021, our work around trust really kicked off with your social science research and background through our consumer surveys and focus groups and the interviews that we've done with a number of financial leaders. All of our research findings are available on the website. I just wanted to highlight one for this audience. One of the things that I find interesting is that we have found that as people have less trust in the financial industry, they're more open to going to informal sources like social media or consumer advocacy groups in order to learn about financial services. So in other words, their ability to engage and influence consumers for the financial industry diminishes when there's less trust, because they're listening to not the primary source of financial information expertise, which is the industry. So you could see how without that ability to engage and then translate how your products are helping clients and consumers be better off, it is the first step in that process has been broken. So this is a gap that we're trying to address in education, both understanding how from a macro perspective, the trends in trust are affecting the strategic orientation of financial companies and what the trends are and what we're seeing in the data, but also being able to integrate that through frameworks with respect to corporate culture and how that ties into ethics and behavioral science. We do have a trust certificate program. We've been conducting it for about 2 years. And for the first time this spring, we're offering it online to individual students. So if anyone's interested in that, we have some information about it online, but you can also reach out to me or Domi or Terry on the team.
Thank you, Azish. Really exciting work that we're doing. I do want to take a few minutes to thank those who have put questions into the Q&A function. I hope I don't mispronounce your name. Mark Teodosio has a question. Ethics are basically the same throughout cultures, nationalities, religious beliefs, and I am sure there are other categories, but when these ethics clash or are different, how do you handle this type of situation? Just because the person in the next cubicle looks like you does not mean his or her ethics are like yours. Love that cultural aspect. Panelists, which one of you would like to weigh in first?
I vote for Todd.
Yeah, I don't know if I want that question. That's a very difficult question. But here's I'll give some quick thoughts. So first of all, there's literature on things like hypernorms, right? That basically are overarching ethical considerations that almost everybody in societies all across the world buy into. They might be called something slightly different, but things like do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's kind of like a traditional kind of hyper norm. So I think one thing is think about what values or norms really cut across all people and lean into those. For a lot of times, I think many companies try to do that. The other is the common thing that every employee should have in common, regardless of their backgrounds, is the values of your organization, right? Like that is why they chose your organization as opposed to someplace else. The tricky thing, I think, sometimes, and this is where companies kind of fall down, is they don't work hard on translating those high-level values into actual behaviors that then we can talk about, understand, and measure about whether those behaviors are occurring. So yes, it might differ from group to group how they look at a particular value and how they see their behaviors of their roles in the organization might be slightly different. But that's something that groups and divisions can really spend the time and the work doing. And then what's really great about that is then you have a set of behaviors that can be linked to those higher level values, and you're kind of creating this common vernacular across your organization. And then you can actually sort of test and determine whether people are following those behaviors. And that's how you really get this kind of, again, sort of this behavioral mindset. And I'll stop there, but I also want to put one plug in because it came up a couple times about continuous improvement. That's where the innovation comes from, is sort of trying to continuously improve. And maybe you don't get it right every time, but that's okay. I don't think, and you can do a lot of things. You can test things and do pilot programs. You don't have to roll out massive programs all across the organization. You can kind of take this sort of innovative, sort of behavioral, kind of scientific mindset. And that's actually what regulators really want more than anything, is to see companies constantly trying to get better and better, even though they might, have a successful program, just to never sort of rest on their laurels. So I'll just put one more plug from, from an academic that the more continuous improvement you can do, the better.
That was such a thorough answer, and I think Mark was satisfied with it. So thank you, Todd. We do have, I think, a couple of more minutes for a few more questions. The next one is for Katie from Lori. Lori asks, Katie, do you recommend Ask Me Anything to be conducted by someone other than the institution leader?
Ooh, that's a good question. We've been doing them around the company in different areas. So this was our first one yesterday for ethics to do it, but we have business leaders host them. We've had functional areas hosting them. So, that was purely it was an hour. I was online. You could put a question. I was going to answer it. We also do have some, we do third party surveying and other assessments as well. But the more just ask Katie anything kind of question, or ask the leader or the functional leader anything, I think having people hear directly from leaders is really impactful and really meaningful.
That's helpful. One more question. Not sure who to give this one to. Maybe Wieke. How is behavioral science and ethical decision in network marketing different from traditional work environment? Or other
Wow,
panels?
that
I
is,
know
I
it's
think, a
a-
challenging one. I think like the beauty of behavioral science is that we work with what we know how behavior works universally, right? So sometimes, for instance, I recently did some work in the APAC region, and people would say, so let me start with that point. People would say, what blame looks like. Let's say you make a mistake here, it's responded to with blame. We know universally that leads to people tending to covering up their actions, whether you are in Japan or in Singapore or in France, the Netherlands or North America, that effect is the same, but what blame looks like may differ. I think it's the similar type of response I would give to this question is, how does it differ from organizations? I think how we interact together, I think the same sort of perhaps minimal requirements that you need in terms of not responding to mistakes with blame, for example, or having a good understanding of what we collectively think what doing the right thing is, just perhaps takes a different shape. But you would look at the same type of aspects, would be my response. But very curious if Todd Katie thinks differently.
No,
Katie,
oh, sorry,
Todd.
Tommy. No,
It's
no,
okay.
I generally think that's right. I mean, one thing that I would say is, though, if you're really trying to do this for real, you're going to be investigating what people's actual, responses and intuitions are about a particular topic. And so, behavioral science isn't like a blanket that you can throw over an entire organization. It really requires you to sort of get down in the weeds about a particular issue, understand really what that kind of behavioral chain is truly made up, and what are those real causes of why people are doing what they're doing. So you should be able to uncover, you'll have some general theories that should apply to everyone, but you'll be able to uncover really like what's actually driving that behavior. And again, that's really important, and that's how you understand what's actually happening at your organization. So that's a positive, not a negative thing.
This was fantastic, panelists. Thank you so much. We do have, to wrap this up, there is a live poll that will come up on your screens, and we would love audience feedback on how we did with this webcast. There's definitely a lot more to continue the conversation, so hopefully we'll have future opportunities to do so. Panelists, thank you so much for your expertise. Audience, thank you so much for your questions and for your time and interest in our webcast. If we didn't get to your question, we will get to it and follow up to it after this panel ends. Thank you again to everyone. We really appreciate your time and input.
Expand your opportunities at theamericancollege.edu.